For 40 years, a mountain swallowed their names. Births went unrecorded. Outsiders vanished at the tree line, and a clan rewrote the rules of family behind a locked timber gate. Before we open the gate, tell me where you're listening from. Your comments help us surface more hidden histories. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what we uncover next. On every official map, the ridge was blank. Surveyors traced their instruments around it, leaving a curious white space where property lines should have cut neatly through the timber. The locals called it the Dead Hollow, though no one could point to a single graveyard there. When stage drivers steered along the foothill road, they gave the slope wide berth, swearing that wagon wheels loosened if you lingered too long under those pines. Even trappers, men who lived by instinct rather than rumor, refused to pitch camp within sight of the old fence. The explanation was always the same: that gate doesn't open for strangers. The structure itself was simple: timbers hewn thick as telegraph poles, cross-braced with rusting iron, and bound together by a chain whose links were nearly the width of a man's wrist. On storm nights, flashes of lightning revealed its outline: a wall too tall for livestock, too solid for wind, and too deliberately maintained for the elements to claim. The gate stood not as protection against animals, but as a declaration that whatever lay beyond belonged to a family intent on keeping the world at bay. No census taker ever recorded a resident inside. The 1880 and 1890 enumerations show the valleys east and west, dotted with farmsteads and mills, yet the hollow itself appears blank, as if the land were uninhabited. And yet whispers persisted. Smoke sighted in winter, children glimpsed from ridges, livestock trails that began in the compound and ended in trading posts miles away. Someone lived there, though the state had no record, and county tax rolls listed no owner. 40 years of erasure stitched into the fabric of official silence. Travelers spoke of strange encounters. A man riding the timberline at dusk swore he saw lanterns moving in synchronized lines, like watchmen pacing in ritual rhythm. Another told of voices carried by the wind. Hymns sung off-key, notes bending as if the singers were trained in music no church choir recognized. More chilling were the disappearances. A census assistant in 1890 who vanished after insisting on surveying the hollow. A peddler whose cart was later found overturned at the slope. 2 children who strayed while berry picking and returned hours later unable to describe where they had been. Each incident became a cautionary tale, reinforcing the invisible border around the compound. What unnerved outsiders most wasn't the possibility of danger. It was indifference. The clan beyond the gate did not plead for privacy. They enforced it through absence. No gunshots fired at trespassers, no threats scrawled on fence boards, no warning signs nailed to trees. Just silence, watchfulness, and the unbroken fact of that gate. Families on the frontier were known to vanish. Famine, disease, winter storms. But few had the resources or will to vanish in place, to continue existing openly yet unacknowledged. That was the Goler clan's genius. Not escape, but concealment. Whispers circulated among storekeepers in nearby towns. The Goler family paid in gold coins too fresh to accompany the hills, traded pelts with no trapper's brand, and sent emissaries who all bore the same narrow features, the same unsettling blue-gray eyes. One merchant remarked that when a Goler came through his door, he could not tell whether he faced the father, the son, or the cousin. It was as though the faces had been pressed from the same mold. People laughed uneasily and changed the subject, for mountain rumors were cheap, but the unease lingered long after the coin was pocketed. Even the church found itself complicit. Parish ledgers recorded anonymous donations slipped beneath the door, tied envelopes filled with gold dust but unsigned. The priest spoke carefully whenever the subject arose, reminding parishioners that every soul seeks God in its own way, and urging them not to provoke needless conflict. Behind his caution lay fear. He knew too well the stories of clergymen who had pushed too hard into hidden valleys and never returned. It was easier to accept the Goler family's silence as a fact of life than to invite confrontation with whatever doctrine they practiced in secret. Frontier isolation was nothing new. Families often disappeared for a season to weather storms or plant fields. But isolation with precision, maintained for 4 uninterrupted decades, signaled intention. This was not hardship forcing withdrawal. This was strategy, discipline, design. Records vanished. Gates reinforced, berths and desks excised from county books with surgical thoroughness. And still the hollows smoked in winter. Still the livestock trails appeared in spring. Still the same pale eyes glinted in the markets when the clan's emissaries slipped into town. Tonight, we open the story with that lock gate, not by breaking the chain, but by tracing the 40 years of silence that surrounded it. Silence maintained so carefully that even the law hesitated to cross. Because behind that timber stood not merely a family trying to survive, but a bloodline with its own rules of continuity, its own grim ledger worthiness, and its own definition of who belonged in the world and who did not. The Goler story did not begin with a locked gate in Montana, nor even with a compound in the wilderness. Its first lines were written across the Atlantic, in the green but troubled hills of rural Ireland. The year was 1831, when famine shadow first pressed itself against the parish boundaries of County Limerick. For most families, hunger was a common curse. For the Golers, it became something more, a justification for retreat, for secrecy, for rules that turned inward. Parish records tell of a patriarch named Goler, a man of unusual education for a tenant farmer. His script in the baptismal registers is neat, his Latin firm, suggesting years of schooling at a level rare for a Catholic in rural Ireland under English rule. He spoke of strength in the stock, purity of a line, phrases his neighbors dismissed as eccentric pride until his household began to shrink in ways no famine could explain. Infants were baptized, recorded in the priest's hand, then vanished from a parish rolls within months. The explanations were always the same: illness, exposure, bad milk. Yet the graveyard at Kilmacduagh showed no markers, no plots dug for these supposed losses. By 1835, whispers grew louder. Midwives complained that they were turned away from the Goler cottage with harsh words and bolted doors. Neighbors swore that children who reached age 10 bore uncanny resemblance to one another. Same eyes, same jaw, same thin, pale faces. By 1840, a parish priest, Father O'Callaghan, wrote in his personal diary that the family conducts itself as if God has given them their own commandments apart from the rest of creation. It was an ominous foreshadowing of what was to come. The real fracture came with the scandal of 1847. That was the year a traveling tax collector, billeted overnight in the valley, discovered ledgers beneath the Goler patriarch's bed. Inside were not records of crops or rents, but genealogical charts sketched in obsessive detail. Each family member's name was marked with small symbols, stars, crosses, circles. A key in the margins revealed their meaning, indicators of strength, weakness, deformity, temperament. The collector carried his discovery to the parish, but before officials could seize the ledgers, the Golers were gone. Cottage burned, fields abandoned, livestock slaughtered where they stood. The family had fled, leaving behind nothing but ash and rumor. Their flight coincided with a wave of Irish immigration to North America, but unlike most, the Goler clan carried unusual wealth. Shipping manifests record their passage paid in gold coin, not debt labor. They arrived in Boston under falsified names, traveled inland under assumed identities, and by 1852 appeared in the mountain settlements of Pennsylvania. Yet every time suspicion thickened. Whenever neighbors noticed the uniformity of their children or the absence of graves for their sick, they uprooted again. From Pennsylvania to Ohio, then westward to Illinois, they moved like shadows across the frontier, each time leaving behind a trail of whispers and half-seen graves. By the early 1870s, the Golers arrived in Montana Territory, a land where oversight was scarce and isolation was easy to purchase with coin. They claimed land in a hollow few wanted, land so hard to reach that most considered it worthless. Yet within months, they had constructed a compound with precision. Thick walls, hidden partitions, storage cellars lined with lime, and most telling of all, the gate. Locals thought the gate was protection from wolves or raiders. In truth, it was a final expression of philosophy nearly half a century old. The belief that the family's continuity mattered more than law, church, or neighbor. The clan's founding myth, passed orally from elder to child, told of Goler's revelation during the famine years. The story went that God had not cursed their family with hunger, but had chosen them to preserve strength through fire. Where others starved, the Golers refined. Where others married out, they folded in. Generations of arranged unions within bloodlines were framed not as sin, but as covenant. To outsiders, it was abomination. To the Golers, it was sacred science. By the time Montana settlers noticed smoke rising from the hollow, the compound already carried decades of practice in concealment. Their ledgers were more detailed than county records, their forged papers more convincing than official charters, and their rituals more binding than any territorial law. They did not arrive in Montana to start anew. They arrived to continue a project already 40 years in motion. The founding myth served not just as a story of survival, but as a binding contract. It told each new child born inside the gates that their life was not their own. They were links in a chain, pieces of an experiment that began with famine and now reached its fullest expression in American wilderness. When you trace the Golers back to Ireland, you see that the compound was never just a place. It was an idea that a family could wall itself off from the world and, through secrecy and sacrifice, bend the rules of blood to its own design. If the locked timber gate was the face the Golers showed to the world, the rules of the bloodline were the iron bars that held their private world together. Outsiders could not see them, but every Goler child born behind the compound walls grew up breathing their weight. These were not laws written in county ledgers or Bibles upon the pulpit. They were rules inked into leather-bound journals, enforced through silence, and carried on the tongues of mothers who whispered them to infants before the child could walk. The first and most unbreakable rule was no outsiders. Marriage to anyone beyond a compound was forbidden absolutely, and fraternization with strangers was watched with hawk-eyed suspicion. Stories say that children caught speaking too warmly with traveling traders were beaten, sometimes disappear from family gatherings for weeks. The Golers believed that outside blood diluted their strength, that foreign traits weakened the line. For them, pure did not mean clean, it meant closed. The second rule was a ledger decides. Every birth was recorded, but not as we think of it today. No joy-filled baptism, no celebration. Instead, the newborn was weighed, examined, cataloged. Midwives, usually elder female relatives, scanned fingers, counted toes, pressed soft skulls with hands trained to detect irregularities. Any flaw was circled in the ledger margins with tiny symbols, shorthand inherited from Eamon Goler's original Irish charts. A star meant the child carried strength of voice or stature. A cross meant weakness, deformity, or instability. Parents had little say. The ledger was sovereign. What was marked there sealed the infant's fate. The third rule was marriage's assignment. Children did not choose partners. Pairings were arranged, usually between cousins, occasionally between siblings when numbers dwindled too thin. Age mattered less than timing. Once a girl reached puberty, her name was slotted into charts drawn generations earlier, and she was set aside for a relative whose traits matched her own. The compound kept no church and no priest. Instead, unions were formalized with ritual meals and recorded in the ledger with initials, never full names, anonymity to shield them from suspicion if outsiders ever seized the books. The fourth rule was silence beyond the gate. When emissaries left the compound to trade pelts or coin for salt, flour, or tools, they were drilled with rehearsed answers. We're from the next valley. Our father is ill. We're only passing through. The same faces appeared year after year, their features so alike that merchants joked uneasily they were doing business with shadows of the same man. Any slip of detail could invite questions, and questions were threats. Those who broke silence faced punishments whispered of but never described aloud. Children learned early. Curiosity was dangerous, conversation deadly, and perhaps the most chilling rule of all, the weak must not endure. This doctrine, phrased in the journals as release from earthly suffering, gave covered practices that horrified modern readers. Infants marked with crosses in the ledger often did not survive beyond a week. Graves behind a compound multiplied with eerie regularity. Each cross carved from the same mold, each mound placed in neat sequence as if space had been measured in advance. To outsiders who caught glimpses from the ridge, the cemetery looked like a garden planted in rows. In truth, it was a visible face of a secret culling system that spanned generations. Inside the compound, these rules were not debated. They were breathed, memorized, drilled. Children grew up knowing their worth depended on what symbol shadowed their name in the ledger. A star meant opportunity, better rations, gentler treatment, perhaps exemption from the harshest chores. A cross meant a life watched closely, lived on borrowed time. The knowledge seeped into every gesture. Who sat at the family table, who slept closest to the fire, who was told to fetch water alone at dusk and sometimes did not return. Outsiders often wonder, how can an entire family agree to such rules, generation after generation? The answer lies in how the Golers define morality. To them, these were not cruelties. They were duties. The journals, written in careful ink-dark lines, framed every death as mercy, every arranged union as sacrifice for strength. Children were not told their siblings were killed. They were told God had called them home early, before suffering could take root. Over time, belief blurred into fact. By the fourth decade, few inside the compound even remembered that other families lived differently. Visitors who stumbled close enough to hear their nightly rituals reported unsettling sounds, chants that repeated names like a litany, interwoven with scripture bent to fit the family's creed. The bloodline must remain unbroken, one phrase echoed, for weakness is a true sin. When pressed, locals admitted they avoided the hollow not because of danger, but because of the weight in those voices. Earnest, fervent, absolute. The rules of the bloodline held the Goler clan together for 40 years, shaping every birth, every pairing, every silence at the gate. Yet the very precision that preserved their secrecy also sowed the seeds of collapse. By codifying life and death so rigidly, they left no room for chance, no margin for error. When outsiders finally breached the gate, they would discover not a thriving lineage, but a ledger written so strictly that it had erased more children than it had allowed to grow. The true measure of family's rules is not in the ledgers adults keep, but in the lives their children lead. For the Golers, childhood was not a season of play or innocence. It was a probationary period, a long test of worthiness under the gaze of parents who measured every trait against the uncompromising symbols in the ledger. To be born behind a timber gate was not to be welcomed. It was to be examined. From the moment a child first cried, the compound listened not for joy but for signs. Was the cry strong or weak? Did the limbs extend evenly, or did one curl unnaturally inward? Did the eyes focus, or did they wander? Midwives trained by generations of practice cataloged these details with the precision of scholars. Infants judged acceptable were swaddled in linen and placed by the hearth. Infants judged doubtful were set aside, sometimes in a smaller cradle near the cold wall, where survival was left to fate, or to the mercy of elders who enforced the ledger's verdict. Those who survived the first year entered a world shaped by silence and repetition. The compound echoed not with laughter, but with drills. Children were taught to walk in line, to keep voices low, to mimic the gestures of their elders. When they asked questions, answers came in scripture or riddles. The bloodline is the breath, mothers whispered, and you must never breathe out to strangers. From the earliest memory, obedience was not merely expected. It was survival. There were no toys, no dolls carved from wood, no hoops rolled across the yard. Instead, children learned to whittle crosses of graves, to sew patches for clothes, to tend livestock in silence. Education, such as it was, came from the journals, arithmetic for rationing grain, letters for copying names into the ledger, sketches of anatomy meant to prepare them for the examinations each new birth required. Even games turned grim. Children traced family trees in the dirt, quizzing each other on who was cousin, who was uncle, who was promised to whom. The most unsettling trait noticed by outsiders who caught rare glimpses was their sameness. Reports described children who looked less like siblings and more like mirrors. Thin faces, high foreheads, narrow jaws, the same washed-out eyes staring from different heights. Traders in town whispered that the Goler children marched in pairs like doubled shadows, and that when one spoke, the others nodded in eerie unison. It was as if individuality had been pressed out of them, leaving behind pale replicas designed for function, not personality. And yet cracks showed. Not every child adapted to the rules. Some resisted, subtly at first. A boy who whistled while carrying water, a girl who lingered at the fence to watch birds. These small rebellions drew swift correction. Punishments ranged from fasting to isolation. Sometimes the disappearances explained away as illness or God's will. Other children responded not with rebellion but with collapse, stuttering when asked to speak, flinching at sudden movements, eyes hollow with a fear too deep for words. The cemetery behind the compound bore silent witness to their reality. By the 1890s, it contained dozens of small graves, all aligned with geometric precision. Each cross was the same size, carved from the same wood, hammered into the same soil. Visitors from the ridge described the site as chillingly uniform, rows upon rows of markers that suggested not tragedy, but system. The children of the compound grew up knowing that missteps could end with their names carved into one of those identical crosses. Stories later collected from survivors revealed the psychological weight they carried. One woman, taken into custody as a teenager when the compound finally fell, described nights where she and her siblings lay awake listening for the sound of footsteps. If the steps paused at their door, terror surged. If they passed by, relief mixed with guilt for whoever's door the steps did not pass. Another survivor remembered playing a private game with her younger brother, counting the graves behind the cabin each spring to see how many spaces had been filled since the last thaw. Childhood was not measured in birthdays, but in the number of crosses standing beyond the fence. What outsiders interpreted as eerie uniformity was, for the children, simply normal. They knew no other world. The gate defined the edge of reality. The ledger defined the value of their lives, and silence defined their language. When a trader once asked a boy his age, the child froze, then recited not years but his ledger mark, star in the corner. To him, that symbol was identity more real than any number of birthdays. The compound's rules produced children who were both survivors and victims, simultaneously hardened by deprivation and hollowed by fear. They carried an intelligence sharpened by constant observation, but twisted by secrecy. Outsiders would later note that these children, when finally removed from the hollow, adapted quickly to tools, books, and modern speech. Yet they struggled with the simplest human gestures, a smile without fear, a laugh without guilt, a conversation that did not feel like confession. The children of the compound embodied the cost of the Goler experiment. They were proof that the rules preserved bodies but shattered spirits, that a bloodline could survive numerically while dying in every other sense. Behind the locked gate, childhood was not a journey of growth but a trial of endurance, a race to see which souls could withstand the silence long enough to become adults who would, in turn, enforce the same rules on the next generation. Every fortress eventually shows its weaknesses, not in the stone or timber, but in the silences it cannot contain. For 40 years, the Goler compound maintained its illusion of self-sufficiency, a closed loop of births, deaths, and rituals guarded by the ledger and the gate. But isolation has limits. Supplies must be fetched, goods traded, tools repaired. And with every interaction beyond the fence, threads of secrecy frayed. By the mid-1890s, those frays had begun to show. The first cracks came as whispers in trading posts. Merchants noted that the same faces, sometimes older, sometimes younger, appeared year after year, always with the same pale eyes and angular jaws. One man swore he had done business with the Golers for 20 years and had never seen a wrinkle among them, never a scar, never a difference he could point to. "It's like dealing with mirrors," he muttered, passing the coin to a skeptical neighbor. The neighbor shrugged, but his glance toward the ridge carried unease. Travelers reported stranger signs. A surveyor mapping mineral claims near the hollow wrote in his field notes they had seen lanterns moving at night in rigid formation, like sentries upon a wall. He noted the cadence of singing carried by the wind, not English hymns nor Latin chants, but something dissonant, a drone that rose and fell like a warning. When he attempted to approach the gate by daylight, he found fresh timber repairs, the scent of tar sealing cracks, and footprints that vanished into the forest with unnatural symmetry, left in right place so evenly they seemed pressed rather than walked. He left before dusk. His map showed a blank oval where the hollow should have been. By then, disappearances had begun to trouble the territory. In 1891, a peddler never returned from his mountain route. His overturned cart was discovered weeks later at the edge of the ridge, goods scattered but no sign of struggle. Locals blamed wolves or outlaws, yet others whispered that the Golers had tired of trading and simply absorbed what they needed. A year later, a pair of berry pickers, children from a nearby farm, wandered too close to the fence. They returned hours later, clothing torn, faces pale, unable to speak of where they had been. One girl later whispered to her mother that she had seen the others, the pale ones, watching from the trees. She never left her family's yard again. The county sheriff dismissed such stories as frontier rumor, without roads or proper patrols. He argued accidents were common, and the mountains swallowed men whole. But even he admitted unease when presented with a letter from a census assistant who vanished in 1890. The letter, never mailed but found in his abandoned satchel, described a family who speak little, whose children resemble one another so closely as to seem unnatural. Graves are present, but none recorded in official death rolls. I intend to investigate further. He was never seen again. Meanwhile, traders noticed oddities in the clan's transactions. The Golers paid exclusively in gold coins, but the coinage bore no mint date newer than the 1860s. Some looked freshly struck, as if hoarded and preserved. Others were foreign, bearing Irish markings unseen in American circulation. Questions about their source were met with silence, then with sudden withdrawal. The clan would disappear from markets for months, returning only when curiosity had faded. Even nature seemed to conspire in exposing them. Harsh winters drove smoke high above the ridge, visible for miles, evidence that hearts burned constantly in cabins supposedly uninhabited. Strange lights glimmered against snowdrifts at hours when fuel should have been scarce. Hunters swore they saw figures moving through blizzards with ease, tall silhouettes that did not bend against the wind. They don't walk like men, one trapper told the Helena newspaper. They glide. His story was printed on the back page, dismissed as mountain superstition, but the words lingered. More troubling were the slips from the children themselves. In 1894, a boy of about 12 appeared alone at a trading post, carrying pelts. When asked where his father was, he stammered, then recited a rehearsed line. "Father is ill, we trade for salt." But when pressed for his name, he blurted, "Star in the corner," before clapping his hands over his mouth. The merchants laughed nervously, assuming the child confused. Yet one noted the phrase in his ledgering years later, when investigators uncovered the Goler journals. The chilling meaning of that symbol became clear. By the late 1890s, unease had hardened into suspicion. Farmers refused to let their children wander near the ridge. Stage drivers added half an hour to their routes to avoid passing beneath the hollow's pines. Hunters spoke of finding traps sprung but empty, as if animals were taken silently in the night. Even the church grew restless. Donations of gold dust slipped under parish doors stopped suddenly, as though the clan sensed that silence alone was no longer enough. These cracks were small, but together they formed a widening fissure. The Goler system of secrecy had depended on indifference, the willingness of neighbors to shrug and avoid. But with every disappearance, every slip of a child's tongue, every lantern burning too long in winter, indifference became impossible. Rumor calcified into fear. Fear fermented into questions. And questions, once spoken aloud, had a way of reaching ears that would not be silenced. The compound was still locked, the gate still chained. But the world beyond was changing. Census officials grew more rigorous. Railroads drew more settlers. Newspapers spread stories faster than fear could suppress them. For the first time in 40 years, the Goler's silence was no longer enough. The cracks in the wall had begun to spread, and soon light would pour through them. By 1901, whispers had hardened into necessity. Too many disappearances, too many unanswered questions, too many smoke plumes curling above the ridge each winter. The county could no longer pretend the hollow was empty. When the governor's office received petitions signed by 40 families, farmers, merchants, even stage drivers, calling for an investigation, they dispatched a man who had the right mix of authority and curiosity, Dr. Nathaniel Harrow, the territorial physician for Helena. Harrow was no stranger to frontier oddities. He had treated frostbite victims who swore angels carried them through blizzards, miners who believed gold fever was a literal disease, homesteaders who mistook starvation for witchcraft. But he was also a man steeped in science, trained in Baltimore, familiar with the new theories of heredity emerging from Europe. Harrow recognized patterns others dismissed as folklore, infant mortality clustering in one family, generations who looked uncannily alike. ledgers that spoke of symbols instead of names. To Harrow, these were not superstitions but signs of something systematic. The journey to the compound was grueling. Accompanied by a deputy sheriff and 2 hired guides, Harrow rode through snow-choked passes, following the narrow trail traders described. They expected ruins, perhaps a half-abandoned farmstead. What they found instead was a gate as solid as any fortress wall, its timbers freshly tarred, its chain polished by decades of use. No lock hung visible, but the iron links were drawn so tight that even the deputy's rifle stock could not pry them. The guides muttered prayers and refused to linger. Only Harrow insisted they press forward. When the gate finally opened, it was not by force but by invitation. A man, tall, white-haired, his features echoing those of every roomer, stood silently on the other side. He regarded them with eyes the color of winter sky, then swung the gate inward without a word. The deputy stiffened, but Harrow stepped across the threshold. He would later write in his notes, "It felt less like entering a homestead than stepping into a closed system, a world unto itself, where every breath had been measured long before we arrived." The compound revealed itself slowly, as though reluctant. Cabins stood in careful rows, their logs cut clean, their roofs tarred against snow. Livestock pens were orderly, gardens neatly furrowed even in frost. But behind this surface efficiency lay disquieting details. Windows were shuttered despite daylight. Curtains were thick, nailed into place. Children moved between cabins with rigid precision, never straying from paths beaten into the dirt. Their faces, thin, pale, and eerily uniform, watched the visitors without expression. Harrow counted at least a dozen, all carrying the same high foreheads and narrow jaws, their resemblance so striking they seemed less like cousins than duplicates. Inside the main cabin, Harrow found what the Whispers had always suggested but never proven. Journals, dozens of them, stacked neatly beneath the floorboards, each bound in leather darkened by age and use. He opened one and felt his breath catch. Page after page of anatomical sketches, names paired with symbols, notes written in both English and Irish Gaelic. Some entries dated back to Ireland in the 1830s. Others chronicled births in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and finally Montana. Each contained cold assessment of infants, strong lungs, good hands. Spine curved, prognosis poor release. Eyes pale, jaw narrow, acceptable for pairing. The cemetery confirmed the rest. Behind the cabins lay rows of small graves, more than 24, all aligned with mathematical precision. Each marker was a wooden cross identical to the next, carved from the same pattern, weathered in unison. The soil bore signs of recent disturbance, as if space had been reserved for the next inevitability. Harrow knelt by one and brushed away snow. The date carved their match an entry in the journal he held, a child born January, released February. The deputy, hardened by years of frontier law, turned pale. "This isn't survival," he muttered. "This is planning." More shocking still were the surviving children. Harrow examined them under the pretense of medical care. Many bore subtle but undeniable signs of inbreeding. Elongated fingers, asymmetrical faces, stutters, and tremors. One boy limped from spinal curvature. A girl of barely 15 showed signs of advanced puberty, her features hardened beyond her years. Yet all carried themselves with the same rigid discipline, eyes flicking to their elders before answering even the simplest questions. When Harrow asked one child his name, the boy whispered, "Star in the corner," the same phrase traders had reported years earlier. Patrick Goler, the clan's patriarch, offered explanations wrapped in scripture and tradition. "The weak are not meant to suffer," he told Harrow. "We release them before the world can be cruel. The line must remain strong, or else it will die. This is not cruelty, doctor, it is mercy." His words, delivered with calm conviction, carried the weight of generations. To him, the journals were not evidence of crime. They were proof of stewardship. Harrow disagreed. His training told him what he was seeing. A controlled experiment in heredity carried out with human lives, a century of systematic inbreeding, an infanticide disguised as faith. He cataloged every journal, every grave, every physical abnormality. He wrote in his report, "This is no family tragedy. This is deliberate practice, continued across continents, perfected in isolation. It is an experiment in blood, carried out beyond the reach of law. News of the discovery spread slowly at first. The sheriff filed charges of neglect and homicide, though the law lacked words for crimes so generational. Merchants whispered to customers. Stage drivers added the story to their repertoire campfire warnings. But as Harrow's findings leaked in newspapers, the compound shifted from rumor to fact. Headlines called it the Mountain of Silence and the family that time forgot. Some dismissed it as sensationalism. Others recognized the terrifying implication. If one family could conceal such practices for 40 years, how many others might be doing the same in the uncharted valleys of the American frontier? The discovery marked the beginning of the end for the Goler clan. The gate, once a symbol of impenetrable secrecy, now stood as evidence. The journals, once sacred doctrine, became exhibits, and the children, once silent mirrors, became living proof of what happens when a family turns inward until it consumes itself. The collapse of the Goler compound did not happen in one dramatic raid. There were no cavalry charges through the gate, no torches carried by angry townsfolk. Instead, it unraveled like a rope left too long in water, fibers slipping one by one until nothing held. Once Dr. Harrow documented the journals, once the graves were measured, the clan's fortress of silence became indefensible. What followed was less a battle than a slow, crushing exposure, where secrecy itself became impossible to maintain. Territorial authorities arrived in August of 1901, armed with writs of arrest but uncertain what laws to apply. Montana had statutes against murder, neglect, concealment of death, but nothing that spoke to generational infanticide, arranged incestuous unions, or a ledger used as both scripture and execution order. The sheriff chose the simplest path, charged the patriarch, Patrick Goler, with unlawful deaths. His wife and eldest sons were taken into custody as accessories. The younger children, pale and trembling, were removed under the watch of church matrons who wept openly at their condition. Witnesses to the arrests never forgot the silence. When deputies clapped irons on Patrick, he did not resist. He raised his chin, eyes calm, and declared, "This bloodline will not be judged by lesser stock." His words, meant his defiance, chilled those who heard them more than any outburst might have. Bridge, his wife, collapsed into fits of trembling, muttering prayers in Gaelic no one understood. The children did not cry. They stood in rows, heads bowed, as if drilled to accept whatever fate was assigned. The compound itself became a kind of crime scene. Deputies cataloged journals, crates of gold coins, tools stained with fluids they did not want to identify. Physicians exhumed some of the smaller graves, confirming what the journals described. Infants with spinal deformities, twisted limbs, malformed skulls. Each tiny body was carefully reinterred, but the memory of their uniform rows haunted the men who performed the work. One deputy later admitted he dreamed for years of small coffins stacked like cordwood. Patrick's trial never reached a verdict. Within weeks of imprisonment, he suffered what doctors called an apoplexy, most likely a stroke, collapsing his cell and dying without confession. To some, it seemed divine justice. To others, it robbed them of answers that only he could have given. Bridge, frail and shaken, lingered in custody until a final pregnancy ended in stillbirth. She died days later, her body exhausted by decades of childbearing and grief. With their deaths, the clan's leadership ended not with absolution, but with silence. The children were scattered. Some were placed in church orphanages, where their uniform features unsettled caretakers and used to such eerie resemblance. Others were taken in by distant relatives who had long denied any connection to the Golers. None adjusted easily. Reports from the period described stutters, tremors, and night terrors so severe that matrons barred them from dormitories for fear of disturbing other wards. One girl, barely 16, attempted to flee back into mountains within weeks of removal. Found shivering in the snow, she told rescuers, "The ledger calls me back." The public reaction was complicated. Newspapers framed the case as both horror and curiosity. Headlines read "Clan of Silence," 40 years locked away, and "The Ledger of the Golers." Editorials debated whether the family were villains or victims of madness. Some progressive physicians seized the case as evidence for growing theories about heredity and degeneration. citing it in journals as proof that inbreeding produced catastrophic results. Others recoiled at the coldness of reducing children's suffering to footnotes in scientific debates. In Helena, the courthouse filled with locals who wanted answers but left with unease. There were no dramatic confessions, no fiery sermons of repentance, only broken survivors and books filled with diagrams. The journals were sealed in territorial archives, their pages deemed too disturbing for public release. To this day, only fragments survive, sketches of infant deformities, charts of marriages that looped in on themselves, phrases written in a mix of English and Gaelic. The weak must be released. The bloodline is a covenant. As for the compound itself, it decayed quickly once abandoned. Roofs sagged, walls split, weeds grew over the cemetery. Hunters avoided it. Children dared each other to glimpse the gate, but rarely crossed the threshold. For decades, the hollow became a scar on county maps, unlabeled, unvisited, but never forgotten. The collapse of the Goler experiment proved what Harrow had suspected. Secrecy is brittle. 40 years of silence. 40 years of rituals. 40 years of graves hidden under snow, all undone the moment light entered. Yet the true collapse was not of timber walls or chains. It was a philosophy, a belief that purity could be maintained at any cost. In the end, the cause consumed the family itself, leaving behind only graves, journals, and children too traumatized to carry the creed forward. What began in famine, what crossed an ocean, what locked itself behind a timber gate in Montana, ended not with triumph but with disintegration. The Goler experiment collapsed under the weight of its own design, a cautionary tale written in blood and silence, preserved only in the uneasy memories of those who discovered it. The Goler compound stands empty now, the timber gate rotting beneath moss, the iron chain rusted and half buried in pine needles. Storms have carried roofs inward, wild grass has overtaken the cemetery, and the once orderly rows of crosses lean at crooked angles. Yet even in ruin, the hollow carries a silence heavier than any wilderness should. It is not the quiet of nature. It is a residue of secrets, layered generation upon generation, a silence that resists forgetting. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow's reports, published sparingly in territorial medical journals, became some of the first American documents linking consanguinity, inbreeding, with severe genetic consequences. He warned of degeneration within closed populations, and cited the Goler children as living examples of what isolation and obsessive bloodline preservation could create. His language was clinical, his conclusions cautious, but between the lines pulsed a horror of what he had witnessed, a family that treated birth as experiment and death as remedy. Historians later placed the Goler case alongside scattered accounts from Appalachia, Pennsylvania mining towns, and Nova Scotia valleys where similar rumors surfaced. Families cut off from the world, bound by secrecy, their children marked by sameness and silence. Were the Golers unique, or merely the most visible branch of a hidden tradition that stretched across frontiers and centuries? The answer has never been fully known, because records remain incomplete and survivors were often too traumatized to speak. The journals seized from the compound, sealed in archives for decades, became both artifact and warning. The few pages released to researchers in the 1920s revealed not just names and symbols, but philosophy chilling in its clarity. Weakness is sin, silence is protection, bloodline is covenant. It was not madness scrawled in those margins. It was method. That, perhaps, was the most disturbing realization, that ordinary men and women, convinced of their own righteousness, could construct a system so cruel and yet so orderly. The children scattered from the compound never fully escaped its shadow. Some vanished into anonymity, changing names and burying their lineage. Others became subjects of quiet study in hospitals, their stutters and tremors logged as curiosities. A few, tragically, carried the creed forward in fragments, raising their own children with echoes of the rules they had been taught. Distrust of outsiders, rigid silence, belief in fate determined at birth. Trauma, like blood, can pass unseen. For Montana, the exposure of the Goler compound served as a catalyst. Lawmakers debated stricter marriage laws, churches renewed calls for parish oversight, and newspapers urged vigilance toward isolated communities. Yet progress was slow. The frontier still offered valleys deep enough to swallow families whole, and authorities still lacked the reach to monitor every hollow and ridge. For decades after the Goler collapse, rumors persisted. Lanterns in mountains, songs carried on the wind, children glimpsed with faces too alike to be coincidence. The legacy of the Goler clan is more than a footnote in medical history. It is a warning about what happens when secrecy hardens into doctrine, when isolation becomes breeding ground for ideas unchecked by community or conscience. The Golers believed they were perfecting themselves. In truth, they were erasing themselves one grave at a time, convinced that each death was mercy, each silence protection, each chain around the gate a shield against judgment. What remains today is not just a decayed compound in the Montana wilds, but a question. How many other gates once stood locked, their secrets hidden by silence, their journals buried under floorboards? Could similar compounds still exist, tucked away in valleys beyond maps, practicing traditions that the world has forgotten to look for? History assures us the answer is yes. Human secrecy is as old as human pride, and the desire to preserve purity, to control blood, has tempted families and nations alike. As you listen to this story, consider the ledger. Consider the quiet scratch of a pen marking star or cross beside a newborn's name. Consider the weight of generations convinced they were chosen, even as they dwindled into graves behind a fence no one dared to cross. The Goler compound may have collapsed, but the warning it carries is not. Isolation breeds more than silence. It breeds systems of belief that can consume themselves whole. So the next time you see a valley left blank on a map, a homestead that trades only in silence, a family whose faces echo too closely, remember the hollow, remember the gate, remember the children of the Goler bloodline, raised not to laugh or dream, but to survive under rules written in ink and graves carved in rows. And ask yourself, what secrets still lie locked away, waiting for the chain to break?